Good afternoon, everyone, to the fourth annual edition of the Interdisciplinary Workshop in Development Studies, organized by the Center for New Economic Studies and OP Jindal Global, deemed to be university. This workshop brings together scholars, domain experts, journalists, and social activists to deliberate on some of the most pressing developmental issues of our time in a workshop format panel discussion. Previous ISDS workshops organized by the center have focused on themes such as the role of gender in economic development, urban transformation, a transnational perspective, acclimatized emergencies, amongst others. The workshops have featured experts and scholars from esteemed institutions such as the SOAS, UCL, the London School of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi School of Economics, and social organizations such as Red Hour India, PEGA, and the Soche Foundation. The 2021 edition of ISDS Workshop will introduce the Access Inequality Index, AEI, which measures inequality across states and union territories in India, followed by panel discussions on the various themes in the index. The index aims to provide an in-depth assessment of each Indian state's performance in ensuring access to basic social and economic services. The workshop consists of 3 panel discussions. The first panel discussion, titled Access to Inequality in India, an analytical study for states across India, will introduce and reflect on the report published and have a look at the performance of states based on different paradigms. The second panel, titled Frontiers of Digitalization, Possibilities and Limitations from an Access Prism, will discuss the potential and limitations of digitalization in building inclusive societies. The last panel, titled Conceptualizing Access to Inequality, Moving Forward with AEI, will have panelists from across sectors discussing and analyzing the role of the index in the future. Examining the digital elements in the Access Inequality Index, the panelists in this session will deliberate on the impact of 3 event catalysts on the digital economy. First, the sharp decline in data prices and exponential growth in data consumption in the past 5 years. Second, the push towards digital payments in the context of government's demonetization decisions in 2016. Finally, the increasing reliance on digital services in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we're delighted to have with us Ms. Charu Pragya, a research associate with the Future Work and Learning Initiative at Tandem. Her current research interests are in the advent of digital work and the resulting labor market transformation, digital development, and social reproduction in the context of modern technological changes. Ms. Pragya has a BA in philosophy from the University of Delhi and an MA in philosophy from Columbia University in the city of New York. We also have with us Mr. Aayush Rathi, a senior member of the Center for Internet and Society. He does disciplinary work on labor informalities, welfare systems, and digitalization. He aims to make academic and policy contributions through socio-legal research, amplifying the experiences of the marginalized communities. We also have with us Mr. Osama Manzar, a global leader on a mission of eradicating information poverty from India and the Global South using digital tools through the Digital Empowerment Foundation, an organization he co-founded in 2002. Mr. Manzar is a social entrepreneur, author, columnist, impact speaker, angel investor, mentor, and sits on several government and policy committees in India and on international organizations working in the areas of internet access, digital inclusion, and misinformation. We also have with us Dr. Sarayu Natarajan, the co-founder of the Aapti Institute. Her research focuses on brokerage and electoral politics in Bangalore, India. Specifically, she works on understanding how internal migrants negotiate political relationships in the city and formation of partisan preferences. Previously, she was a student at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. In the past, she has worked at McKinsey & Company as a consultant and in socially focused venture funds, microfinance, and education. The session will be moderated by Ms. Mansi Kedia from ICRIA. She's a fellow at ICRIA and has over 9 years of experience in economics. Her research include telecommunication policy, trade, and industrial policy. She's published papers, reports on telecom and internet regulations, the impact of information technology and industrial policy in India. Her ongoing research includes issues related to the governance of internet, competition issues in India's mobile handset industry, internet shutdowns, and the future work in India. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Kedia.
Thank you so much, Ada. Thank you for the introductions. We indeed have a wonderful panel, and I've been lucky to work with a few of them for several years. So I'm really happy. And like you would have noticed in the introductions, this is an interdisciplinary panel with everybody having worked with or for or within the digital ecosystem. So I'm looking forward to our discussion, which in fact, when we were deliberating the ideas with the students and with Dipanshu at the center, we were trying to see how we could dovetail their research on inequality and access and what we could do on the digital side, because that is the sort of area that I am interested in. And we found a really nice sort of symbiosis in what the report was talking about and what we wanted to achieve, because a lot has been spoken about the good things of the digital come out much more easily than the limitations of digital, right? So we wanted today's discussion to be a bit more balanced. So while we're talking about all the achievements that have that have come to us and to all all Indians, there are also a lot of limitations. And I know each one of you have worked on the limitations and have spoken a lot about it. So I really would like you to highlight that while you're talking about India's digital journey. We'll organize the discussion this way. I did speak to you about this earlier. We'll start with opening remarks. Everybody can speak for like 7 to 10 minutes. Please feel free to take an additional minute or so. I'm not going to be a super strict moderator. So take your time, don't want to cut off your flow. I do have some follow-up questions that I will ask you. And then I'm going to hand it over to Krishanu, because the students have put together some questions that he wants to ask the panelists. And these might go beyond the topic of the panel discussion, but are related to the digital ecosystem and access issues. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Charu. She's facing some connectivity issues as we speak of digital access. So we should let her go first. And Charu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for having me here. It's a really important issue. I would like to actually start from a point that the index raises, which is around the lack of inclusive growth and how due to large inequalities in economic and social realms, how these inequalities then translate into a lack of opportunities, and how inequality shouldn't just be seen within the framework of GDP growth, but actually all these other markers. So moving from that, it's really important for us to maybe look at the right to access as equally as a right to digital access, as a right to an internet or a digital ecosystem and infrastructure that promotes justice in all these other forms. So justice within socio-economic groups, and how they then are governed by the state. So as gender is one of the modalities that the index focuses on, maybe that's something that I can comment on a little bit. As most of us know, India is one of the 3 countries in the global south that have the largest digital divide. And then many studies that corroborate that and establish that there are many normative factors to this, social and economic, that create a highly restrictive environment when it comes to gender norms. And they influence how women and non-binary individuals who don't actually fall in the normative ways on the spectrum don't have access to internet, don't have access to devices, don't have access to the existing digital infrastructure to the same levels as men do from various different communities. So we must ask ourselves, how does this isolation and being isolated from information and communication processes, how does that impact just the existence, how you negotiate your citizenship, maybe, that would be a terminology that I'll use here. How would that then debilitate your struggle for justice as a citizen, especially within a larger trend of digital welfareism and digital welfare dystopia, maybe, where we see, actually I'll come to that later. We've been putting the horse before the cart. So part of my understanding of the matter and what I took from the index, and this is something that the report itself doesn't directly point to, but I think this is a good, this is where it ends, and it's a good an area of research that maybe we can deliberate on a little more, is how, as now in the modern world, information and communication has become in some ways a root of the core processes of how individuals as citizens negotiate power between ourselves and with state and other private authorities. This is how we build norms and values, being cut off in a lot of ways because the existing infrastructure doesn't cover you, impacts your access to all these other necessary social security mechanisms as well as opportunities. And these opportunities aren't privileges, they're entitlements. So if we look at them as entitlements, this further begs the question that when we talk about access and digital access and making welfare schemes and social security mechanisms accessible to a larger group of people within India, does digital mediation really, is that a goal and of itself? Or is it something that that the outcome of it has been predetermined and the processes actually do not match the existing reality? So I would actually, I write on labor, and at Tandem I work on their Future of Work initiative. And we've been very closely looking at the eShram portal. So maybe I hope I don't steer too far away from the core issues here. I just wanted to share an anecdote that there was recently a small gathering, a digital gathering of activists and unionists and researchers to discuss the eShram portal. And during the proceedings of this event that was organized by CIS, one of the unionists pointed to how they found it really difficult to get women to register on the eShram portal, and in part because it's an issue of recognition. The way things are structured is that the portal doesn't recognize a lot of other forms of labor as being legitimate, even, and this is a way to like extend recognition. The portal itself is trying to solve a problem through socio-technical means, which is to extend recognition where recognition wasn't already there, where there were no contracts. And in doing so, these unionists went to women and they asked them, why do you not want to register? Like there's a queue and we're trying to get people to onboard, like we're trying to onboard people on this portal. And they couldn't recognize their own labor as being legitimate. They're like, oh, these are for, this portal is for people who perform a certain kind of labor, and I perform domestic work. In my household and other households, I perform work where the currency isn't obviously like often monetary, but sometimes in kind. So those are the kind of domestic economies that we ignore when we put all our faith in socio-technical solutions. So going back to the question of welfare, one of the pillars that was raised during like in this index was social security, and I'll call it welfare in my little bit. And the way looking at how a lot of these technical mechanisms are it's become more attractive for governments across the world to introduce them in welfare social security schemes, is because it's an attractive entry point, not only because it seems so benevolent, but also because the beneficiaries hold certain positions in the larger political economy that makes it really difficult to demand accountability. So in this era that's is hest upon us of digital governance, we find ourselves, especially in India, like in a lot of situations where you look at the PDS system and the process of digitizing the PDS system. And then you look at how in the complete absence of a mobile network, internet infrastructure, access to devices, you end up with a digital solution that alienates and excludes the people that it aims to tend to and provide for. So yeah, do I have a little more time, or should I?
Sure, Charu. Yes, and if from the work that you were speaking about e-shram, I mean, if you have other things to say, please go ahead. But from the e-shram example, because the index also focuses on state heterogeneity, if there's anything that you find that is also brings evidence to some states or some communities doing better than the others, if you have any data or anecdote that you'd like to share, we'd love to hear about that too. Yeah. In addition to whatever else you were planning to speak about.
I actually don't think because it hasn't been implemented yet, and it seems like across the board, most states are not performing really well, but and that is largely because of centralization. Sometimes centralization in itself becomes a problem, right? And as the report points to, there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how states are performing on these different metrics. And then when you have a system where you centralize the mechanisms to distribute welfare, or the mechanisms to register yourself, for example, you have all these complete breakdowns of infrastructure where you, as an individual, as a worker, for example, I wouldn't know whom to turn to because there are no service centers, and state governments haven't actually been asked to set up service centers on a district level or a village to village level. So yeah, so that was, I mean, I don't know if that really answered your question, but there have been breakdowns throughout, and they're still like in the process of figuring out how to get this platform up and running. The bigger question is like, what is this platform for? When most workers are finding it really difficult to even onboard themselves.
Thanks, Charu. So I think great points. One, on just questioning socio-technical solutions to start with. I think that's interesting, which means that we need to, I mean, not only focus on how to make them work, but whether or not as an idea it is work. So whether it's design versus ideas, I think that that was a really good point. And I also really liked your point about the fact whether digital access is the ultimate objective, or is it is it the goal in itself, or are we looking at it as a process to achieve other welfare objectives? So great points, Charu. I'll come back to you and now turn to Osama. And Osama, if you can share with us your views on access inequalities, the role of digital. You have a lot of experience on the ground. What do you think? What is the potential of technology, and where are the limitations?
Yeah, thanks, Mansi. I was just going through the first few pages of the index, and it's quite interesting that it's very pleasing to see that all that what we have been working for the last 20 years is looking like written in English here. So listen, access is fundamental now. Access to digital, I'm saying, or digital infrastructure is fundamental. What I would like to define is say that access pre-COVID and access post-COVID has actually defined the terminology from inclusion to exclusion. That's very important because although the exclusion was happening for the last at least one decade, but all of us and most of the people have been talking digital from the perspective of complementarity, from the perspective of inclusion, from the perspective of an extra step to, adding something extra or something efficient. But most of the time, people were not approaching digital from the perspective that without which we cannot live, or without which we cannot survive, or without which nothing is possible. It still didn't come into the category of roti kapda makan, but COVID has actually proven at a highest level. I mean, at the lowest level, we knew it. And that's what Digital Empowerment Foundation has been working. And we work most of the villages only because we know that hundreds of things are dependent on digital. Your biometric is dependent, your access to bank is dependent, your access to food is important, which is basic, right to food, right to education, right to health, right to information, right to, all these are now dependent on technology. We knew it for the people who were physically remote, for the people who were isolated. So it is something like saying that you had a right to food, but you don't have a means to reach it. You know what I mean? I mean, in the sense that you got the right on paper, on a piece of paper, but can you access it? Accessing it was dependent on digital infrastructure. If internet is working, your biometric is working, your authorization is working, the government database is working, the synchronization of database is working, and so on and so forth. So all this was actually digital, and it still is digital. Now, health and education got very largely included in this bucket in COVID. Suddenly, as you were in remote, you wanted consultation for doctor, your health center is not working, you are not reachable, you are isolated. Can I talk to some doctor on video, and I can get consultancy? I'm ready to pay. I am at home, I can't go out. Can somebody bring food to my place or my ration to my place? I am at home, I can't go out, and can I get a video call with my teacher to get my education? I'm not even coming to the entertainment. Of course, the elite access. I'm actually dividing your 4 A's of availability, affordability, approachability, and appropriateness into my 4 A's. Access elite, access middle class, access deprived, and access excluded. So you have like, this is the 5G, 4G, 3G, 1G. If you have 1G, you still have no access to education. If you have 2G or 3G, you still can't do the online transaction. So your meaningful connectivity or the quality of connectivity is further dividing you out of the access and making you excluded. So the elite here, whether you are rich or not, is somebody who has got 100 Mbps connectivity or 50 Mbps connectivity or not, where, I mean, you and me, I mean, suddenly I'm sure some of us can become hazy to you, and then you'll talk like a, e, u, and then you'll say that, okay, this is not working. Can I make a WhatsApp call? Can I make a a normal telecom call and patch you here? So the quality of connectivity, and the quality of access is as digital divided as anything else. So it's not only that if you say, the statistics that I have is 530 million WhatsApp users in India. We cannot include them as digitally not divided. Not at all. Because at least, and out of 530, I'm sure only 200 million is in rural India. Out of those 200 million, most of them can't do a simple video call and transaction online. And then there is a barrier of literacy, education, comfortability, behavioral, cultural, and so on and so forth. So access certainly has to be seen from the perspective of quality infrastructure, its availability, its affordability, but also its contextualization and behavioral inclusion. We know that millions of people who are connected, even qualitatively, would not like to do the online transaction or the banking because they are uncomfortable, they don't trust the system, they don't know where the money, they have always touched money, they have felt money, they have kept money, they have given money to people by hand. I mean, they can't fathom the fact that, you know, I have got the payment and I haven't seen it, and I have still returned all the payment to the people I had taken loan from. You know, this is a serious behavioral issue. And this is a serious trust issue also. I mean, all the centers, thousands of centers that we work in, where our Suchnapreneurs have an open view of their bank account. That goes to the on a different area of trust. This lady comes, she doesn't know anything except knowing where to put the thumb. She puts the thumb, and voila, you are online. And this guy is looking at all her balance and everything and saying, Amma, kitna paisa transfer karna hai, batao. And then she said, 3,000 chahiye. So he said, okay, connectivity nahi kaam kar raha hai. Aap mere se 3,000 le lo, baad mein main withdraw kar lunga. And then he will open the bank account and withdraw that money. And no gapla, nothing, but it's purely trust. Where is the security system in this one? You know? And when will she actually do the transaction on her own? Or her great-grandchild, who is 5-year-old today, will do the transaction ultimately. And she will never be able to do the transaction. So it's very interesting that, you know, I'm really happy that you people have brought out this great index. I have no idea the depth of it, that how it has gone, but what I am telling you is that digital divide or access is a multi-layered issue. It's a multi-layered definition. It's multi-layered penetration. It's multi-layered challenge. And it includes anything and everything from social, behavioral, literacy, education, comfort, trust, and of course, the quality of infrastructure and its availability. Lastly, I will comment is that the reason why we have got an extremely bad access equality index in most of the state is not because of the lack of infrastructure. It is because of the lack of understanding of the contextualization of available infrastructure to make it relatable to the system that we work in. For example, we have got connectivity reached almost all panchayat. Why is it not working? Why BharatNet is not working for the rest of the people? Because we have not integrated it properly. We are not looking the connectivity from the non-technological perspective. Why 1.4 million schools not primarily seen as an infrastructural inclusion of access, digital access as a Wi-Fi availability, abundance of Wi-Fi availability in each school? Don't spend money on laptop and tablet. Just make the connectivity available in the schools, and you will suddenly see that people have diverted their attention from buying something else to buying mobiles or buying laptops. I mean, we have seen that. How come suddenly your Kirana wala has got the smartphone? He never had that budget. He still doesn't have that budget, but still has got the smartphone because prioritization of the investment, you know. And you will do that exactly like the way that COVID has brought in diversion of prioritization of your affordability into buying laptops and mobiles and smartphones or second-hand smartphones and so on and so forth. Similarly, all the health center why it cannot be video enabled? It's very simple. It's very simple, video enabled. And then ask people to come to the health center to talk to any doctor who doesn't want to come to that place for many obvious reasons, but you can still talk to the person. Why IT-BPO cannot make a provision of all the doctors available for all the panchayats level on video? We are doing that as a project. Health is not only curative. 85% of health is preventive, which is only consultation and talking and taking advices. And then gradually everything, you know. So I would say that there is a huge lack on the you know, people who are elected members, people who are the bureaucrats, to make the policy not from the technological policy, but the policy of the subject, and then see that, you know, road should not take a policy in their hand to build the road in every village. It's a village that has to tell that agar road hota to we could have transferred the, you know, transported things from here to there or something like that. You know, it has to be reversible. So yeah, I will stop on that one, but I hope I did not lectured more than it was desired.
No, not at all. Thank you, Osama. Two really great points, at least from my point of view. I think one was the multi-layered access issue, and that, you know, we need to sort of break down access into technology, infrastructure, behavior, politics, and the local contextualization that is important. And the last point that you were just making on, you know, bottom-up policy making, you need to ask people the policy they need. I don't know how we'll ever facilitate that, but great points. I'd like to invite Sarayu next. Sarayu, if you can turn on your camera. Yeah. Look.
Hi. Is
Hi.
that all right in terms of, am I audible?
Absolutely, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Mansi, and thank you everybody for having me. It's a hard act to follow, Osama, but I'm going to try. So, you know, the report, of course, is fascinating, but I'd like to build on some of the themes or other questions that this word access itself raises. And I think they're adjacent to the report and, you know, worth sort of being part of the conversation, particularly in the context of this digital access that we look at. The first is, I think, you know, very often when we think about access, the frame for thinking about it is, you know, whether you have access to it and what are the existing conditions that inhibit or enable access. So, for example, devices, infrastructure, technology, context, even elements of your personal identity like gender, class, caste, community can play a role. And then, of course, there's an intersection set of issues that arises at the intersection of this. What also in a certain way plays a more insidious role in thinking about access? What also, sorry, I don't know if I lost my phone suddenly rang. I apologize for that. What also inhibits access in a certain way, and this is something we're seeing from our research, is the way in which digital spaces in themselves are structured and in themselves are mediated. So just in terms of who has power on digital spaces and how they are enabled to participate might also play a role. So being attentive to not just pre-existing structural inequalities that inhibit access, but also being attentive in a certain way to the ways in which digital spaces are themselves structured, the language in which material is available, to the way in which you know, like digital spaces are structured, to the way in which physical spaces that enable access to digital goods are all things to be attentive to. And these are new inequalities in a certain way, new forms of inequality that digital brings with itself. And being attentive to it is critical. I mean, there's, you know, an emerging body of research around some of these questions. Just to give you a very, it might seem, at the risk of sounding it being sort of almost like facile to say it, like on Amazon, right? You have this idea of a shopping cart, right? It's an unfamiliar language to very many digital users. And what that what happens with that kind of sort of imagery or design or narrative on digital spaces is that even if you're participating, you're still excluded. And the barriers are subtler, more insidious, but they're definitely there. So being attentive to sort of the difference between what structural inequalities are exacerbated or play into this question of access versus in what ways you know, new barriers or new sort of inhibitions are created is something worth thinking about. The second dimension that I would love to spend a little bit of time on is the idea of like access is a right and intersection of this question of access with the state. And this is perhaps my political science training talking, but there has to be a certain normative, I suppose, difference in thinking about access to something that the state gives you digitally, such as welfare, versus the ability, let's say, to participate in markets. And this could be payments, but I don't know if it's just that. It could be some forms of work, for example, that are mediated digitally. The nature, like the normative meaning of access is very different in the two. And it, that is not to take away from the fundamental injustices, or whether this is created because of the presence of digital, or whether it exacerbates something that is pre-existing. But there's a subtle and a nuanced difference, and something worth exploring. For example, if you think about, let's say, digitizing justice, right? There's something there about this as a right from the state, or it's something, or it's a state function, versus being able to participate, let's say, in a digital marketplace. And the rights that flow, the questions of response, like who is responsible for ensuring access, are all things that are sort of necessary to unpack in thinking in a more complicated way about this question in itself. The third dimension, and I must apologize, my understanding of the report is, I just read it and it's fairly preliminary, and I definitely hope to dig deeper. But one of the things that we've observed in thinking about this question, particularly of digital access, and it's something, Ada mentioned that I'd done my work on brokerage. This is social intermediaries play a critical role in access, regardless of whether the type of access is digitally mediated or not. And so paying attention to this sort of social capital, particularly network social capital, like who are you connected to, what kind of social and political relationships do you have, and what are sort of the power dimensions of those, is another sort of deeper dimension of access that is worth paying attention to. And in some ways, the breakdowns around access might lie in thinking about network social capital more thoughtfully. I strongly believe in it. I strongly think communities are very important in thinking about digital access and empowerment. Access is just, it's a step. But thinking about empowerment more significantly requires, engaging with this idea of community. How has community changed? Because networks now are not necessarily only geographically rooted. They can come from anywhere. And there's also, we're looking at it a lot, the rise of, say, digital intermediaries who can play a role in sort of navigating some of these questions around access. So, this is a very important and a very timely conversation. But I think, we need to continue to complicate this idea of access, and we can't stop with saying access requires access. So then therefore we'll fix these instrumental conditions around access without paying attention to some of the political and the social relationships that play into how the digital world operates. So I'll pause here and hand it back to Mansi to sort of take this from there.
Thank you so much, Sarayu. I know you're not too well, but thank you so much for participating. Yes, you should have your hot water. Lots of complementarities between what Sarayu and Osama actually spoke about. And it almost felt like, they were talking about the same thing, but just from different lenses. Osama more from the ground, and Sarayu more, conceptually about the problems, the exclusion that Osama spoke about that COVID had brought, and what Sarayu said that has digitization or digitalization in fact increased these or created new inequalities. So I think we'll delve a little bit more on that. And now to Aayush, last but not the least, Aayush, looking forward to some of your views on inequality problems or limitations of digitalization. But I'm just hoping, can we start with a bit of optimism around what digital has actually done, and then we jump into, oh my God, you're thinking. So yeah, and then we'll also talk about the limitations. Yeah, thanks, Aayush.
Okay, this is, I was actually pretty happy when you framed the panel as constituting of people who are critical of the internet. I was like, yeah, this is exactly where I find, it's a like-minded group of people, but now you're asking me to start with a bit of optimism. Maybe I'll end on that note and continue sort of talking a bit about
I mean, sort of building off of what Osama, Sarayu, and Charu before me have spoken about, and I'd really sort of want to start at the point of talking about access as well. So, the report covers it. It's also sort of becoming more widely known as, is the sort of gender the sort of gender gaps that exist in both sort of digital access and also sort of what happens after access, so in digital use cases and so on. So these gaps are stark, but over the past year it seems that we've made some incremental sort of exponential almost gains in sort of narrowing this gap, but it will be very interesting to sort of continue following those numbers, see if that trend sustains, right? And if it's not like a black swan event, much like the pandemic itself. So it's one thing to keep an eye out. And the other thing, and this is also sort of what in Osama in particular was sort of emphasizing on, is that, and Sarayu as well, is that access is pretty, is extremely multidimensional and intersectional, right? So one of the things that we find is that the conversation around digital gender gaps is not sufficient in and of itself. So there are a multitude of demographic cuts that we need to further look at. So age, geography, educational levels, even marital status, right? All of these make like a world of difference in sort of determining who has access to the internet, and in not like very obvious ways also. So for example, one of the things that we find is that social media use, for example, increases the likelihood of social media use is inversely correlated to like age. So older people are less likely to be on social media, except when we look at adolescents, right, where there is a stark gender gap between like adolescent boys and adolescent girls using the internet and the social media as well. So it's, yeah, it's, so all of these work in the relationality of these cuts is something that needs to be explored more. And I think it's complemented by some of the qualitative insights we have also on access and use case. So I think it's extremely important. And the data does not do like a complete job of it also, right? So for example, we do know that a lot of women's access to mobile phones is shared, right? And while this would like technically constitute ownership of mobile phones through through a lot in a lot of survey data, but what kind of access is it, right? That's the question that has been raised by speakers before me, and that's something I want to emphasize on as well. So the shared ownership severely limits agency with what you can do with the mobile phone, and is often like supervised by sort of patriarchal members of the family, right? It needn't necessarily be the father, but often is an elder brother or even a younger brother for that matter. And that's like an extremely crippling way to be able to explore the, to be able to use the digital. So, this is just to sort of make the small point that there is no silver bullet really to solving digital access issues, but like, the responses that we generate, and I think DEF is a great example of some of this, is that the responses need to be sort of embedded in like the material, situated material realities of women and other marginalized communities, right? So, having said that, I think at the same time, there's always the burning question of sort of balancing between getting more people online and the severe risks that are also associated with participating in digital spaces, right? And that continues to, it becomes like a harder sort of conversation to have with given how embedded like the digital is becoming in accessing like either welfare systems or even like private economic sort of markets. And often then it just boils down to like a sort of question of livelihood, right? And often what happens in this calculus between sort of digital access and digital risk is that we like end up in many ways invisibilizing the risks in favor of ensuring access, but without but at the same time we do not have, without like also entirely acknowledging the limitations we have in sort of dealing with like the risks associated with offline spaces, right? So issues of, let's say, online gender-based violence, cybercrime, and the kind of pervasive censorship and surveillance that digital spaces have become associated with, all of these like come to mind, right? And this is also perhaps one of the ways in which we can think about the eShram portal, right? As Charu mentioned, that the biggest question around the eShram portal is, what is this even for, right? And at this point, it seems to be like a mere data collection exercise of like as much informal and unorganized sector work as possible, with no clarity on what I mean, who and what the kind of entitlements and protections would be. So, I mean, this kind of exemplifies the point that this sort of single-minded or like approach to getting more people online and to recording people digitally is, I mean, is like an extremely dehumanizing process, really. I mean, it commodifies people and looks at them merely as data subjects, right? And like to be able to effectively participate in any kind of like private or public forum that will lead to any kind of welfare or labor market outcomes, it means that you have to sort of make yourself visible to these um, forces of sort of data extraction and recording. So and so, sort of this is um, but what does happen is that it's considered an acceptable price to pay, right? And to be able to get access to these spaces, and that is the ideology that has governed the design of all of these public and private digital spaces for quite some time. That but however, the question, I mean, and this is what Sarayu was also sort of talking about, is that the experience of, I mean, even after access, even when you are online and using a digital platform, it's that the experience of this participation is also, I mean, it takes on like extremely extremely gendered forms, right? And this is where I want to talk a little bit about. I mean, so on the one hand, there are the social media platforms, and like there are some very interesting sort of ways in which sort of behavior online of men and women differs. So, for example, um, it seems that women use social media networks to a lot more to stay in touch with people they know, and men on the other hand use that a lot more to relatively engage a lot more with people they don't know. There's a preference for sort of closed platforms such as WhatsApp that women have, as opposed to an open platform like Facebook. And this is all like ways, I mean, sort of defense mechanisms, ways to sort of guard yourself against the risks of online. And that like does, I mean, this sort of further creates this gender divide in terms of like how much access to the broader web or the broader internet that you have. So in the case of, I mean, and that does say a lot and sort of gives a lot of food for thought to think in thinking about how, especially platforms with a strong sort of community orientation need to be designed to be able to be more sort of hospitable to women and marginalized communities' participation online. So, sort of going back to sort of a different kind of platforms, that is digital labor platforms. Again, this is something that has been mentioned, but I want to talk earlier, but I want to talk a little bit about that in detail. And so one thing that we find is that the traditional sort of labor market occupational segregation often maps on into digital economies as well, right? So masculinized and feminized job segregations continue to remain rampant in the digital economy. But what we found very interestingly also was that given the state of digital access, given this gender divide, given the age divide, given the rural urban divide, and alongside the axis of gender as well, often jobs that have typically and historically been feminized are also becoming more masculinized, right? So when we, the example to give here is that of like on-demand cleaning work, right? It has become synonymous with like men workers, where historically cleaning work and domestic work has been like a largely feminized occupation. And this just boils down to the simple fact that you need two critical things to be able to like do on-demand labor, on-demand like work at large. One is that of regular access to a smartphone that you own and are able to sort of use, and the other is that of mobility, and it is on both of these axes that like strong patriarchal norms restrict the freedom with which women may be able to like move from like job to job, which is the essence of on-demand work, or to even be able to like access these jobs in the first place because they lack a smartphone. So there were some interesting ways in which like digital platforms had accounted for, I mean, in the domestic and care work sectors, which is something that we had looked at in like great detail, had sort of contextualized these things. So for example, some of the most popular platforms are low tech interfaces, unlike on-demand platforms, right? And not requiring access to a smartphone. You still require a phone or even a shared user phone, but often the husband would be the point of contact for communicating with with like a woman domestic worker. So there is, so the broader point that I want to make is that that often the business models of these transnational platform companies often reproduces like racialized and gendered hierarchies and broader economic markets also. So, and I just want to sort of slightly problematize the disruption narrative that is very, very strong uh, uh, in sort of the regulatory forbearance and even the popular forbearance that these platforms often receive. Is that, I mean, we can like reorient our focus to look at what is being disrupted. And so sort of just to give some examples, is that like the disruption of I mean, the restructuring of global value chains by these platform companies often directly like impacts women's livelihoods. And two examples of that of the agriculture and micro retail sectors in the global south, right? Often online food delivery platforms undercut women's home-based catering enterprises. Platform as supply chains in agriculture also approved like women-led agrosystems with like wide-scale implications for household food security. I mean, and another emerging concern simultaneously is that of with like sort of platform mediated employment arrangements, is that of like erosion of workers' rights to social protection, right? It's this uh, precarization and disposability that is characteristic of the platform economy in most countries. Does not really bring about what they call as this empowered flexibility and entrepreneurship that is happening. So a small point to be made about COVID-19 here is that we are seeing this rapid sort of digitalization of the economy, right? But it is happening in sort of this app without any sort of commensurate sort of changes in social spending, especially on like infrastructures of like of care, for example. And I mean, it's I mean, it's in all likelihood it'll lead to like a pretty sort of pessimistic outcome here, which is that of like intensification of women's unpaid care work, right? And at the same time, there is this lack of corporate accountability for like workers' rights and like a lack of regulation of platforms. So what I think is the way ahead and could be useful and a useful sort of frame to sort of address some of these issues is that in adopting the lens that this the panelists before me, even the report talks about in a little bit, is to have like this broader political economic view when we are looking at questions of access and questions of like the digital at large, not just that of access. And I think that, and I have found a lot of value in sort of adopting some sort of feminist lenses to situate people's bodies, communities at the heart of these conversations, right? And it is particularly helpful to sort of center the limitations of what has like popularly been referred to as techno solutionism, right? That the idea that any slick technological interface can solve like challenges rooted in like deep-seated political economic issues. And the other thing to like another top-down policy approach that is like sort of pretty helpful was also sort of endorsed earlier, is to look at questions of the digital in also the broader picture of like allied regulatory frameworks as well. So we are seeing global governance battles around IP, trade, data localization, data colonialism, sovereignty. So I think there is like a lot of potential in like situating the digital within some of the other mainstream allied frameworks instead of looking at it in isolation, sort of in isolation. And as importantly, I'm also like a strong proponent of bottom-up approaches. And I think, I mean, I don't know how what the future for like bottom-up approaches can be, but I feel that it's like still, I mean, I think we find ourselves still at a stage where it's important to create like the spaces where dialogues between, you know, social movements, trade unions, activist scholars can happen. I think that is really sort of where we need to sort of bring ourselves, put our efforts to create those kind of civil society agendas. And I mean, I've personally seen like a lot more promise with sort of that idea of a theory of change. So I'll stop with that. I'm pretty sure I went to 10 minutes, but I'm sorry about that.
No worries, Aayush. Great comments. And no, you know, while you were speaking, I realized that, you know, how we moved from, you know, government policies and government agendas of access to digital networks to actually talking about business models and platforms and how they also impact access and the implications of that, like, you know, especially the issues on generalization of labor markets. Really great points there. I'm going to quickly, I have a few questions. I'm going to, without taking a lot of time, because I know Krishanu also has questions. So I'll start with Osama because he indicated that he, you know, he needs to leave. So I just, you know, Osama, referring to some of the comments that you made in your opening remarks, I wanted to ask you that should the government be thinking about policy making for digital in a different sort of way? Like, you know, do we need to see more of other policies before we are digital ready, or is this okay, except that you know, we need to think of it in a more bottom-up way? So just wanted to hear your responses on that. So are we jumping the gun on digital? Are we like saying no, connect, but we're actually not ready to connect and serve? So just wanted to hear your reactions on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, they need to have a gear change in the approach to policy. There's no doubt about it. And the couple of examples that are there is that look at NOFN, who gradually became BharatNet. And now you must have seen announcement of PM-WANI. Now NOFN didn't work properly because of delay and infrastructure laying and all that. Then BharatNet become you know, last mile operability issue, in the sense that they were unable to figure out that once it reaches to the panchayat, what do you do out of it? I'm sure if Sarayu travels to the Mysore area and those areas, and I travel in the rest of the areas, wherever you go, you will, I mean, the best of the examples would be that Wi-Fi is working, but no data transfer is happening. Kyun nahi ho raha? I mean, why? You have it's something like the old time. The wire is there at home, but MTNL phone pe baat nahi ho rahi hai Mansi se. You know, so you know, so that means there is something wrong the way you design policy and infrastructure deployment. So I had written once an article that we look at digital in an analogous way, you know. So your approach to digital is also very you know, brick and mortar, and you don't think of real time reaction, you don't think of how it will operate, you don't know how to, you know, use those. So certainly it is very, very simple, is that once your connectivity goes, you don't know how to contextualize it. You know, ultimately you have made CSC as a last mile implementation partner for the connectivity. How can you guess that, you know, a single boy, I mean, of course, or an entrepreneur will do the connectivity of the entire area? I mean, you need to really figure out how do you make it, how do you make a Airtel at the last mile? Basically, that's what you need to figure out. How do you make a geo at the last mile? Through the network that you have already created. And that is the reason I want to go back to say that forget about connectivity. Connectivity provider should be the service provider. The service seeker should write the policy. So the Ministry of Education should write a policy that how do we want to use the technology for the better education or the real-time education for our children who are living in the remotest area. And for that, just place an order to either Railtel or MTNL or BSNL or Jio कि मुझे पहुंचाओ connectivity कल. I don't want to talk to anything because we are already have, I mean, there is enough budget to do that. It is the contextualization that we need to really figure out. So the policy approach is very, very important. That how do you make a policy? TRAI should not make a policy for, or for that matter, Ministry of IT and Telecom should not make a policy that how the Anganwadi worker is going to access internet, you know, which you have unfortunately made necessary. You can't get the nutrition if the Anganwadi worker will not do the form filling online saying that kitna khana chahiye bachchon ke liye or kitna paisa chahiye or whatever. That's very, very surprising, you know. So it is the other way around. That's the basically is what we need to look at. And we are, every day that we are delaying it, we are making more and more people excluded. It's very simple. That means you don't want, your intention is wrong. It's very simple.
Great. I think that's a great point. Osama, I don't know if you can stay on for a few more minutes.
I'm there, yeah.
Krishano had a few questions which we thought we'll get towards the end, but since you have to leave, I'll give the floor to Krishano to ask his questions to you. Krishano, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, Osama sir. It's a pleasure to have you in the panel. And as you spoke about, you know, quality of infrastructure and, you know, availability of infrastructure and access, and also the lack of relatableness in digitization, I have a question that is basically a little related to that. In one of your columns, you talk about how an information-packed mobile phone will be the end of patriarchy one day. So our report finds that only about 21% of women across states are actually mobile internet users, compared to about, say, 42% of men. So what are some reasons, you know, for this skewed distribution? And secondly, what are some interventions that can help in this regard?
So your number is the reply to my assumption and my belief that the more delay in the number to become otherwise, the more assertive our patriarchy is, and that is happening everywhere. You can go all in your neighborhood, you can go in your mohalla, you can go in your thing, and or maybe all the girls in your college, and you can ask them, did they get the mobile first, or their children, their brothers got the mobile first, or when your father got the mobile first, or your mother got the mobile first. And this patriarchy is DNA, so you can't even know. It's subtle, and it's there. The reply to the question is that how do we fight it and how do we make this statistics reverse, is by simply formulating schemes and you know, mechanisms to give the mobile as a priority to women. So you create a scheme like that, feministic schemes, you know. For example, we had we work in 1,000 locations with Sushnapreneurs, grassroots level, which are basically village level digital entrepreneurs. Initially, our approach was to have anybody who is working very well. Then we learned and we started getting those who can move around, and mostly boys came. And then the third approach was that let's reserve the seat on Sushnapreneur, that you know, we need to have girls to be the Sushnapreneur. Then our approach changed, and suddenly we started getting those women. Now we have made a policy that our Sushnapreneurs to be 100% women. And the fourth policy is that every service that you are going to provide to anybody who is coming to your center, has to be more than 50% women. So they now keep on looking for women as a beneficiary and girls as a beneficiary. So that's how we change the policy. And some of the mobile distribution policy or a mentorship policy program that we brought in, we make it totally women oriented. So when you go with that approach, it's something like mere ko 50 rupees mile hain, and my father says it has to be distributed only among women. You know, if you can't make your women come forward to take this 10 rupees each, then I'm sorry, I will go to some other village, you know, where people are ready to accept those for women. So that also shows that how deeper in patriarchy you are in different panchayat or village or district and talukas. And it has happened in many times. And all the excuses, actually all the excuses from transportation, movement, late night, evening, cycle chalana nahi aata hai, ladki hai, ye sab patriarchal bahana hai, you know, everything is a patriarchal bahana. You know, even if I consider that I'm giving to boys because they work better at night and they can let, then I am using it as an excuse. You can change the program by saying that ke 6 baje savere se kaam shuru karo, ladki will come, and if you don't have to work at night, you know. So why inclusion of women to be the subject of something which is also patriarchal in design? You know, so you know, and I also say that internet is feminine, but it is being handled by the male, and that's the reason why its penetration is lesser among women. And to fight internet access, you also have to make it go into the hands of women. How many telecom policy writers are women on their board? Go and ask, and you will find none. जब तुम्हें दिखेगा ही नहीं औरतों की नजर से, तो तुम औरतों की प्रॉब्लम कैसे सॉल्व करोगे? तो you know, so this is very, and I also say that making internet and access feminine, it will be more economical, it is more impact oriented, because they need less monitoring and evaluation, they are more accountable and more responsible, and their conversion rate of every impact is much higher at a lower cost than men. Their attrition rate is also low. So even if you feel simple economics and simple welfare impact, it should be in the hands of women.
Super strong statements there. Thank you, Osama. Krishanu, I'll take over. I just have a few questions from the other panelists and I'll turn it back to you. Charu, are you there? I had a question for you. Yeah. So we were speaking about simple, not simple. When you were speaking about access, we were looking at infrastructure, broadband. But in some of the comments where you spoke about the design, I was wondering if we looked at more complex technologies like, AI, 5G, IoT, virtual reality, do you perceive that this is going to change the access or the inequality equation more? Is it going to make it far more unequal, or is it going to be better? And if it is going to make it, and whichever way it goes, how should policy respond to it, or how should we prepare for it? And how should on one hand policy prepare for it, and how should businesses or people within the ecosystem prepare for it?
I suppose I have a really limited response to it. Would be that I was actually starting from the point where we must question why policy responses assuming that there is a level of digital penetration and access, and then building policies on that assumption, right? So when you talk about more sophisticated technologies and the speed at which they're already being instituted in very select realms, while we're still dealing with issues of workers just not being able to understand how OTPs work, and an entire system that's supposed to cover like crores and crores of informal workers. In the example of e-shram in particular, because that's what I mentioned last time, I'll continue with that example. 39 crore more informal workers, where the system crashes and doesn't send you an OTP. And we all faced that during what happened with COVID. So my question would be, why should we leapfrog? Why are we leapfrogging from a policy perspective? What really are the benefits of leapfrogging when it comes to public services and welfare? Reinforcing my previous point, it's not a privilege, it's a right. So when you create so many layers of exclusions that only a very select people can filter in, and here I'd actually want to point to the heterogeneity that the index, like it brings to the surface. Your experiences with these systems could differ in very fundamental and meaningful ways depending on where you are in this country, while still being under the broader category of a citizen, whatever that still means. And I'm currently based in Goa. Goa was on top of that list, right? And it's a great place to be, but until a few years ago, there were no Wi-Fi connections. It just wasn't a concept in some of the villages. In the village that I'm in currently, when they were installing my Wi-Fi connection, they told me that nobody in the neighborhood had a Wi-Fi connection. So they had to like draw a wire like from quite a distance. And what happens if you're trying to access these systems and you have an understanding of them being a right, of social security being a right, and you're in a really remote village in Bihar trying to get ration? Is this a system, like, are we prioritizing efficiency over like equal access? Quite clearly we are, but whom does this efficiency really service? Like, whom is this efficiency for? It's just more efficient for perhaps the policy makers to have like these socio-technical systems, because it's quite easy to then blame a breakage of some sort of a breaking point in the system itself rather than like your political intentions. So yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm not sure if I completely answered your question. I did steer away quite a bit, but I really do feel like this is the fundamental question before we even move on to the questions of more sophisticated and what they can possibly do for governance in countries like India.
Thanks, Charu. This is not Richa, this is Mansi. My desktop just shut down suddenly. So Richa sort of has given me her device to use. So you believe me, this is me. Okay. No, Charu, that was great. Actually, in fact, my questions are around this, and coming to Sarayu now, I just wanted to understand that this hyper digitalization in all our policies. You read the National Telecom Policy or you read the METI policies. We're just gung ho about getting universal access. We're talking about 5 Mbps, 50 Mbps. We're talking about connecting all villages, all cities, everyone. But do we need to step back a little bit? Is analog better than digital if you're looking at a few contexts? And I just want to question our pursuit for universal access and digitalization. All of you are talking about the limitations. I myself am aware of the limitations, but today I'm just feeling that are we not ready for this hyper digitalization as a country, especially like in the Indian context? I'm not saying that this applies maybe to Germany or even the United States. Much more unequal, I guess, than Germany. But even like, is it an India specific issue, or are we just going crazy and not understanding in this frenzy of going all digital? So wanted to hear your views on that.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And it came up earlier in the course of this conversation. I am very positive about the power of the internet around very many questions of access. I also think that it democratizes access to very many things. It democratizes problem solving. So there's a whole lot that digital internet, like that intersection can do. So I generally remain positive about the internet, but I do, to the point around hyper digitalization, there is something to investigate there. And I think therefore, the question is, how do you sort of take something that is like it almost sort of a theoretical idea or a theoretical underpinning, and then take it to something that's practically feasible, where you balance the rights and interests of communities as well as the needs of the state. I mean, the hyper digitalization, in a bland way, one can say, yes, it's a problem. It's a problem anywhere, even in advanced countries and economies like Germany. Just because it's digital, just because they're better off, or there is a sign of lesser inequality, it doesn't necessarily mean digital is the right way to go forward. I think there is in our policy, even in sort of the broader sort of entrepreneurial market ecosystem, this tendency to think that digital is a substitute for what is fundamentally like a interpersonal good or an interpersonal service. And, there's a problem there. But, the one frame that one can potentially apply around thinking about hyper digitalization is this idea of like the state versus the market, where it is something that the state is to do. And I think Osama sort of alluded to it as well, where it is something that the state is providing, right? Where it comes out of a constitutional or a legal right that an individual possesses. Hyper digitalization, it's not even a question of hyper versus not hyper. It's just a question of you always have to have an offline fail-safe, whether it's better or not, because that's the sort of baseline modality for access. And that's sort of like the moment it becomes a normative frame, like if you think about, let's say, technology in the context of access to justice, let's say civic disputes can be resolved now through some kind of online mediation mechanism, right? But fundamentally, the ability to have a civic dispute resolved is a constitutional, it's a right that a citizen has. There's not a question of hyper versus not, there's not a question of digital versus not. Everybody has to have access, and the state effort must be to find the best way to make sure that every citizen has equal access. And this could be the digital is sometimes the better mechanism, sometimes it might be something else. And I think that there's something to think about there. In the context of market, and I sort of thought about it earlier as well, like in the context of the market, it's a harder question to answer. Like hyper digitalization, like, Aayush pointed out, is accompanied by a whole range of other problems around surveillance, sort of excessive data use, and a range of other sort of issues that other people, I suppose, are better positioned to talk about. But the question of access there alone, I don't know whose responsibility it entirely is to fix, right? There is a certain failure that, because the market is only going to serve those that it thinks profitable to serve, and that's not going to change. And thinking about access from the in the context of markets, in the same frame that we used to think about access to the state, is a bit, I'm not sure. I feel like we need to do a little bit more like normative theoretical thinking there. And there, hyper digitalization has problems that affect rights once you're on the digital space. It has implications in terms of a broader set of individual rights, human rights even, because, for example, AI might have very discriminatory impact, and that digitalization can have, end up excluding communities of people from, let's say, access to credit. Similarly, if it's applied in the domain of health, digitalization in health can affect an individual's right to health. But how that is fixed, I think, is a more complicated intersection of like policy and sort of better resource allocation to problem solving. So I'll step back on this, but I think hyper digitalization is an attractive concept, but complicated when you sort of start to break it down into sort of the ways it might play out. And I'm generally, like I said, hopeful about digital in its ability to do a whole lot more than our analog world can achieve, especially in the post-pandemic time.
Great point, Sarayu. I think I really like how you broke it down. It's very interesting, and I'm trying to think back to some of the reports that I've written, and wondering whether we did justice to the thinking at that point. But I think these are new ideas and new concerns. So I'm actually I'm wondering if this means more regulation, and if we're thinking from the market's point of view, And that's just scary to start thinking about right now. Anyways, Aayush, because you spoke so much about platforms, I had a question in my mind, we've been there have been a lot of reports that talk about the problems related to access, to rural communities or poor families vis-a-vis richer families, and education and online schooling. I mean, because I'm one of the parent victims, I've been thinking a lot more about it, about the division between the have between the have and the have nots. And there is a division, and without going into much of my personal view on this, but there are parents are divided on whether online school should go on or children should be back in school. But at a more fundamental level, while I have a view, I do have an option, but in certain families there isn't an option, right? And for which they want students to be going back to school. So in terms of these particular platforms, which provide essential services, what is your view on, I mean, you spoke about genderization, that is one, but in terms of education as a key development catalyst to where society is going to be for our country going forward, what is your view on that? And related to that, I also read some stuff on how families, and here I'm also generalizing a little bit, but relatively well-off families where the digital access is better, digital skills are better, are using the internet and its facilities and platforms for much more productive use. They'll be scheduling meetings, they'll be shopping, they'll be doing the better sort of activities. But a lot of the rural communities are engaged mostly in video watching, social media, the less productive. And is this divide really obvious to you? Is this something that you'd worry about? And would you break down the use of internet into productive versus unproductive, and therefore this becoming another sort of access related problem? Couple of questions there, but just pick and choose and answer whatever you'd like.
Yeah, all tough ones actually. And I mean, it would be also great to know what your personal view on education platforms is. But I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the word essential services. I think it's sort of it came up in the last year and a half or so. I mean, it became relevant again, and it's very interesting to trace. I mean, sort of observe the ways in which these platforms sort of try to make it explicit that they are performing essential services, right? So in many ways, also taking on like a public infrastructural function, right? And that opens up this very interesting possibility to, I mean, rethink of them. I mean, not just as private corporations, but also as performing some key public functions. And I think that opens up this whole realm of regulation that may or may not be desirable. But in either case, I think I think it's interesting you mentioned that. And it's also, I mean, and it's also quite well known now that over the last, again, coinciding very much with the pandemic and like how our responses to it was so, I mean, were almost entirely digitally mediated, right? I mean, in that, I mean, even something as simple as working from home, right? It's, I mean, it's of course an extremely sort of, those who are able to do it come from like a significant position of privilege, and it is coming at the expense of the bodies of those who aren't able to do it, right? And that I think is like, I mean, it's quite depressing, honestly. And in one of in a consultation we had organized, like I think around like April last year or something, which is like thinking through what's happening with COVID within platform work groups. There was this, I mean, it was like articulated in like very, very strong words that why is it that we should be like putting ourselves at the risk of like severe disease, even death to be able to deliver your groceries, right? It's really, I mean, that's what it really boils down to. So in any case, so I think um, uh, yeah, I mean, so similar. I mean, all of these platforms really flourished right over the last. I mean, I think their valuation, all of their valuation skyrocketed. Byju's is on a massive acquisition spree with like incredible amounts of venture capital infusement. So, uh, yeah. So I think there are like a bunch of issues here, right? One is that like I don't really have an opinion on what education. I mean, whether what they did even as like an sort of in sort of an in-between intermediary, like a temporary intermediary of sorts. I mean, I think that if that was the approach, that would have been fine. That in the when we don't know enough about the uh, pandemic, I think, I mean, and perhaps the other response would have been to not have it like any kind of digital means of education at all. It's probably an okay stopgap, but the issue that arises is that once they have that foothold, then it's extremely hard for it to not become like a permanent feature of people's lives. So I mean, and the issue with all of these things, the issue with digital platforms providing essential services, and I mean also sort of I was thinking about this when Sarayu was talking about like thinking about the market and thinking about the state as um and their roles within like sort of technology deployment and development. I think it's difficult to think about it precisely because it's what the neoliberal structure is all about, right? It's the withdrawal of um, public sort of public entities from providing these essential services and the greater role of private actors in doing this. So we are seeing this bunch of seeing a variety of partnerships that emerge between digital platforms and other stakeholders, between platforms, between the platform and the state, between platforms and civil society. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that are happening that we need to think about uh, and unpack a little bit. I don't really have an answer to the education sector, but I think broadly speaking, I mean, looking at them as key sort of urban infrastructure is important. Looking at the limitations, I think I mean, for the simple fact that I mean, most of these platforms operate in major urban cities. I do not think that could have been a nationwide response at all, right? I think looking at challenge or even like an urban cityscape response. I think, I mean, looking at the urban as a homogeneous entity or the country as a homogeneous entity is simply not feasible given like the wide gaps in like practically all kinds of infrastructure that exists that make it, I mean, which you need to be able to access the digital infrastructure on top of which this is built. So yeah, I'll probably stop with that. What there was a second question that you had about digital skills, was that?
Now is yeah, it was a question that, you know, do you think that there are productive and unproductive uses of the internet?
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, so I mean, it's open to the other panelists also. Sarayu and Charu, if you want to chime in on, you know, if you think that you know, the well-offs or, you know, the digital natives, so as to speak, or families that are have better access to technology, have better knowledge of digital use, they're able to utilize the internet a lot more, and perhaps for productive, even income making opportunities, right? Vis-a-vis, you know, the use in rural areas. And a lot of surveys, you know, if you see and you look at, you know, rural use of internet is very largely focused on social media. Is there a problem there? And would you think that this is again an access related problem? And is it something to worry about? And is this a good way to think about productive, unproductive? And does it become an access issue somewhere? So I
I'm
mean,
happy to jump in on that. Just I mean, a small thought is, I mean, I think we underestimate how much this idea of access in itself requires access. Like for you to be able to productively use the internet for whatever it is, you require a certain type of education, a certain almost like habitus, like the sociologists call it habitus, right? Like the ability to navigate the grammar of the internet, the ability to navigate the grammar of digital spaces. And all of that is critical, unarticulated knowledge that very many people possess over others. Like it's a function of class, it's a function of caste, it's a function of location, it's a function of community. And as social scientists, it's important to recognize there's also obviously intersectionality. Like that is unabashedly or unlimitedly true, I suppose, in a manner of speaking. This question of productivity, I struggle with it. I think that social media, I mean, there's a certain paternalistic lens that sort of underlies it in any case, right? To think that just because you're using Facebook, it's an unproductive use and you shouldn't, is one side of looking at the problem. I think the question, if one needs to sort of frame it around productivity, is what are the inhibitors or barriers that limit the ability to use the internet in other ways. And I think they are very significant and they're very invisible, like particularly around access to, let's say, the internet to use or to better access the state, make claims of the state. Very many of these things are quite difficult, quite hard. There are not necessarily the right kind of channels. They're not accessible. And digital brings in a layer of sort of much more difficulty in doing these things versus much more making it much more easy. So, I mean, the productivity unproductivity debate, it is an empirical reality as to what the internet is used for, but the value judgment associated with it, I would be more careful to also ask what are the associated barriers to using. Because, for example, social media use doesn't need to be intermediated, right? Whereas very many other types of access to the internet, whether it's a child accessing it for the school, whether it's a woman accessing it for social welfare benefits, often requires intermediation, which is difficult to access in the absence of social capital. So why aren't we asking that question? Why aren't we saying what are the barriers, what are the limitations, what are the constraints that might enable sort of different uses of the internet? Like productive versus unproductive is different, but like different uses of the internet, how can it be made easier? Apologize. How can it be made easier? How can it be smoother, more safe? Of course, that's also very critical. And how can, of course, there be sort of data protection, privacy enhancing measures that sort of surround this as well, which are sort of, you know, the layers to this access question more broadly. And I'll pause there and hand it back to Mansi.
Thanks, Sarayu. Aayush and Charu, very quickly, I know Krishanu has questions, so I don't want to not let him get an opportunity to ask. So any quick responses from Charu, you, and then Aayush?
Is it to the same question? The question of
yeah. If you have any, I mean, you don't. Please don't feel.
I
have an opinion.
So I do feel like Sarayu properly illustrated my own very complicated relationship with leisure at large and also leisure on the internet, right? And especially when you look at it like within the frameworks of how there are new types of labors during COVID specifically, who could work at home and use the internet for more productive means versus who could not. So there are all these new kind of marginalizations that are being created, and we should be slightly sensitive towards usage, the usage of the internet for leisurely means, and like look at it like within larger like social relationships and material conditions. When you have to necessarily, you can't work from home on a laptop, your relationship to the internet is very different from somebody who can only work from a laptop, your educational qualifications, your social capital, your cultural capital. And as Sarayu said, you don't have the grammar to navigate it in the same way. You don't have the grammar to navigate. Internet is not your habitus at that point. It's an escape versus somebody who has to necessarily use it for those means. And how those like that creates a hierarchy within like internet users, and to try to flatten the usage of the internet and why people use the internet would be to be amiss in these regards to completely overlook like these complexities and nuances. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to further chip in on what Sarayu had already very well articulated.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Charu. Aayush, for the last word. No.
No, I fully echo what Sarayu and Charu had to say on this matter. I mean, I was also just thinking a little bit about how, I mean, social media use is also not like a homogeneous, flattened activity. I mean, it is often like the intermediary for a lot of economic activity, especially undertaken by women's cooperatives and collectives in India. So the other sort of, I mean, I don't agree at all with sort of the productive unproductive kind of framing but I still I mean, I was also thinking about how one of the sort of enablers of sort of women's access to mobile phones and the internet has been to be able to justify a use case for it, to be able to justify a reason for why they need a phone. And often economic activity, and especially in the past year or so, and like education, as you were mentioning earlier, all of these have become like strong reasons for women to be able to get access to a regular access to a mobile phone. So I think it's so what I think the productive sort of, you know, not like shifting away from like the productivity lens does is sort of open up this whole realm of ways in which ways in which the internet is used, the ways in which it may be used. So I mean, often there is the divide between economic and non-economic activity also that happens, which is also I mean, it's usually associated with how well corporations may be able to monetize or how it feeds into the large sort of profit logic of corporations. But I think in this case, it's really all the same, right? It's the generation of data. I mean, at times, I think even the generation of data around entertainment choices is far more critical to like emerging profit logics of corporations than it is. So one of the things that is happening is that video is one of the predominant ways of internet consumption in India now. And I think that I think some of these lessons are very important for like me personally as a researcher, when I'm trying to communicate some of my research to or make it accessible, to think about like non-textual ways in which the internet is consumed, to sort of rethink, sort of move away from the ways in which I may use the internet and like others around me be using the internet, as compared to like people with different levels of privilege, access, literacy, and so on. I'll stop there.
Great, this is useful, and there's some consensus there, so I'm glad. And I want to take an opportunity to thank all of you for joining and for an engaging discussion. I think I have a lot of new things to think about. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Krishanu for his questions. Please, I think these are questions from the students, and they're going to be building out their research. So I just, I would urge you to just stay on for another 15-20 minutes and respond. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Mansi.
Thank you, Mansi. I have actually a list of questions prepared, and I'll just ask them at one go for each panelist here. So for Charu ma'am, I have the question about how are programs such as AI for All and the National Strategy for Artificial Intelligence, how are these programs inclusive? Like, does technology fundamentally then negate the social fault lines? And would upskilling basically or reskilling in AI, artificial intelligence, really ensure marginalized people access to new job markets? It is something that's one question that I had for Charu ma'am. For Mr. Aayush Rathi, sir, as you talked about, platformization and disruption, etc. The informal economy has faced severe losses in livelihood as a result of the pandemic, which is a very critical metric of access to decent work in our index, basically. So can digital platforms be used to alleviate the dismal situation of the informal economy? And secondly, can we say that platformization will enable or disable the bottom-up approach that you talked about? That is a question that I had. For Sarayu ma'am, I actually was wondering, how that corruption, discrimination, among others, they very negatively affect the appropriateness of access of marginalized communities, which is again a metric in our index basically. And as a result, they have to rely on informal channels basically. So can we say that the digital be used to leverage or address this lacuna in service delivery? Or can we use those informal channels or digital intermediaries for our own benefit? That's the question I have.
I'm happy to go first if that's okay. No, that's a difficult question, and there's actually quite a bit of emerging literature that is starting to talk about intermediaries in the context of digital, and it's definitely one of those sort of complicated questions. See, I am very wary of like broad brushstroke depictions of community relations as being corrupt or venal or problematic in any way. It's there are sort of very many problematic elements to it when access to particularly benefits from the state is mediated by political intermediaries in some way. But having said that, there is quite a lot of evidence to also show that local intermediaries can play a critical role in bridging the gap between citizen and the state. And this is particularly in the context of state access. So it's hard to say it's good or bad. I think there's a certain amount of complication. There's a certain amount of sort of variation that comes with geography and context and who is the party in power, like how is the politics of that place sort of necessarily structured. These are all questions to sort of evaluate. I think therefore even the question of digital intermediation must be looked at from that sense. But I think with digital, there's an additional, you can call it a complication or an additional layer almost, which is the idea that geography can in certain cases not matter at all. Like, for example, welfare, very sort of geographically limited provision, service provision and governance, of course, is it coincides with the geography, obviously. But there are very many more types of access. Aayush alluded to sort of use of the internet for more broad sort of citizen activities, commercial activities that might necessarily not have a geographic lens to it. Where this question of intermediation is, it's much harder to analyze, but to say that this is sort of one versus the other, bad or good for me is a bit hard. I think that intermediaries can play a critical role. I think community is very important in this question of negotiation. As individuals, we're often disempowered, even in the offline world. And what has sort of led to constructive change in very many policy domains, sort of, even in everyday quotidian aspects of life, is collectives, is the coming together of people to make claims of different entities, particularly the state. I'm tending to think here much more of the role of the state. But actually, if you think about it, even more recent mobilizations from platform workers are against the platforms and not the state, which is a bit of a mind blown kind of, at least from the framework perspective. But I think there's something to think about the positive good that intermediaries can bring, without seeing them as corrupt, but to pay attention to the ways in which these incentives might change is very, very important as we go forward. So yeah, I would be very, very wary of painting them as broad brush, corrupt, venal, evil, petty foggery of some sort. It's more than that. But if I may just take a minute, I've really enjoyed this panel discussion and I wish I could listen to it as a listener, but I've got a really bad cold, so I'm going to step back if that's okay, and then pass it back on to you. But thank you very much. Thanks, Mansi, for the moderation, and thanks, Krishano, and everybody else on the team for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Aayush, and thanks, Charu, I don't know if she's dropped off, but I would really love to hear this as a broader discussion and for this to continue much longer.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Bye.
Sarayu.
Okay,
Do take
Aayush.
care.
Bye.
Yeah, we'll maybe get your Aayush. We'll get some final thoughts from you, and we'll just bring this to a close. Thank you.
Yeah, let's do that. So the sort of first part of the question was if platform work can open up avenues for some of the challenges that, loss of livelihoods, loss of jobs that have happened within like the broader informal sort of economy. And sort of my immediate response to that is that assumes that platform work is not informal work, which it very much is. It shares it's informal work with the technology interface. Essentially, that's like really one way to look at it. So it has the same kind of precarity, the same kind of sort of subcontractor chains. It has the same sort of kind of insecurities, lack of social security protections and whatnot that the informal work has traditionally been associated with. So so I think the sort of response there is not that it's all bad. At this point in time, I would not willingly, knowing what we do know currently about labor and platform work, I would I would not willingly want somebody to have to be working for like the mainstream platform entities at least. So my provocation here is that we need to rethink what platform work can look like. I think the way in which I think platform work is here to stay. I think there are like several public facing functions that like the model of digital platforms is able to do well. But I think we fundamentally need to reimagine who platforms are made for and how they are made to be able to make it a feasible sort of to make it like a feasible pathway into safe and sort of decent work, as the ILO calls it. So I think there here I see some sort of overlaps between ongoing proposals around urban employment guarantees, and I think this is also one way in which platform work can fit in to be able to like have like an urban equivalent of the NREGA basically. But that cannot and should not happen without fundamentally reorienting the working conditions that platform workers have to deal with. There was a second part to the question as well, right?
Maybe the question that Krishanu you asked to Charu, because I'm not sure, because it might be her internet. She said there's no power at her place. So maybe you can address it to Aayush, and we'll just maybe if you have any observations you can take, and then.
Sure, I actually just sort of I'll do both. I'll also respond to the second part of the question that was asked me, which was about bottom-up approaches and I think platform work. I just remembered. Sorry about that. So I think we're seeing sort of very interesting approaches to workers organizing and resistance that are emerging, and that is where the bottom-up approach currently lies for me in terms of pushing back against corporate policies, like government policies around labor and platform work. And it's so for example so historically it's been a challenge to organize gig workers simply because of the absence of a shared space like the factory, right? And that makes it hard. Like the workers are intentionally atomized and distanced, and there's that like sort of like lack of a shared space that exists. But like emerging from so there have been forms of solidarity that we that you also often see when you may be hailing a cab from Uber or Ola, which is where workers are on the phone a lot of the time. Drivers are on the phone a lot of the times with other friends, other drivers, and like sharing their experience of work. And that is where solidarity is emerging from in these urban pockets. So the urban poor tend to be located in certain pockets, and that is where a large part of the workforce for platforms is also coming from, and that has become another site of organizing a resistance. And very interestingly, going by the theme of today's conversations around like challenges of the digital, but having to balance it a little bit with some of the things that it can like it does well. So one of the things is that like the use of digital tools for this organizing also. So I mean, both in terms of like getting together, like through like, let's say WhatsApp groups, and off late, you'll be seeing a lot of like Twitter or Twitter posts by ex or current like delivery workers and drivers, but also through a rejection of the digital, right? So logout protests is becoming like a very sort of much adopted way of sort of resistance and organizing. At the same time, the kind of hyper-local terminology that has been sort of adopted by platforms is also being reappropriated for these kind of localized outbreaks. So it's not still happening at the scale of like even a city or hub or like, you know, like a major part of the city or anything, but it's still happening in like very localized kind of ways, because that is also the granularity at which the sort of corporate policy for platforms is devised also, that within it is in this pocket that this is the living cost and this could be the wage per kilometer, as opposed to like an adjacent pocket, let's say in South Delhi, as opposed to one in like West Delhi. So it like that is the level at which this is happening. So I think it was initially written off. The platformization was supposed to have been like super crippling for like labor unions and labor organizations. But I think some very interesting ways are being devised, and even traditional unions of taxi drivers, for example, are expanding, you know, sort of their focus to sort of bringing I mean, both having solidarity between traditional taxi drivers and platform mediated like taxi drivers, and sort of bringing that within their sort of agenda as well. I'll stop there. And yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aayush. This was so enriching, and taking on from Mansi, and I mean, for a fantastic, moderation, bringing out such a range of perspectives from each of our panelists. I would like to especially thank Aayush, Sarayu, Charu, and Osama for taking out their time on a holiday for joining us. We look forward to receiving maybe more detailed, in-depth feedback on our report when you get a chance to take a look at it. As mentioned at the correspondence that was shared earlier, we wish to have this index actually evolving with every year. It's more like an app we're trying to create as a methodological tool for a macro level assessment on issues around access, equality, and digital access is something that we wanted to have a separate pillar established on. The issue was that we didn't have state level data available for a lot of the pillars that the report conceptualizes within the index.
Yep.
So we might also reach out at some point of time for some stakeholder consultations at the time when we restart the project sometime early next year. So Aayush, we look forward to receiving some thoughts. The team at ICRIAR, Richa, Mansi, they'll be all invested in the process. So thank you so much. Thank you again, guys, and we'll bring this close.
Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations on the index and the report.
Thank you.
Speak soon.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
May I request once Ada, Vyonana, and Krishanu to stay. Are we still live, Ajayji?
Sir?
Are we still live or stop?
Okay.